Now, only testing your code is one super important aspect of writing automated tests. But there also are a couple of other rules or recommendations that I can give you that will help you write good tests. For example, you should follow that AAA, that Arrange, Act, Assert pattern, which I already introduced in the previous course section. It's a pattern that simply helps you keep your testing code organized and structured and understandable. It also kind of helps you write simple basic tests, which is something you always want to do. And that leads me kind of to the next thing already. Your tests should typically only test one thing. You don't want to write a test that tests three different aspects of a function or three different functions altogether. You don't want to do that. Instead, one test should test one unit and one behavior or one expected outcome or result of that unit or function. That's what your tests should do. For example, in the code we wrote in the previous course section, all the tests we wrote always just tested one thing. I'm testing if I am getting the sum of two numbers in an array if I pass that array into that function. I don't also test what happens if I pass an empty array. You want to test one thing per test because then when a test fails, it's clear which behavior or which expected outcome didn't work. If you have multiple things that you're testing in one test, if that test fails, it's not clear for which reason it failed. So that's why you want to test only one thing per test. And that's really an important rule which I do recommend that you follow because it will help you write good tests and it will make sure that your tests are actually helpful. In addition, when writing tests, you want to keep them basic and simple and focus on the essence of the thing you're testing. And that is also something I mentioned before in the previous course section already. For example, here, when I'm testing whether all the numbers in an array get summed up, I could start adding multiple values here. I could make this test pretty complex to test this one basic thing, whether it adds up all the numbers. But I don't gain anything by doing that. Instead, the test just gets a bit harder to reason about, a bit harder to understand and maintain. And if the test fails, we might have to think whether it's really just the behavior we expected that failed, or if it was our too complex setup that broke something so that we actually weren't testing what we thought we were testing. So you want to keep your tests simple and focus on the essence of what you're trying to test so that you have short, concise tests that test only one thing and that help you understand why they failed if they fail. And also kind of related to that, you typically want to keep your number of assertions, your number of expect statements in a test low. Now again, in the examples I gave you in the previous section, most of the time we had only one expect statement, and personally I try to minimize these expect statements as much as possible and get to one expect per test, but that's not a hard rule, and there also can be tests where having multiple expect statements can make a lot of sense because you're testing one and the same thing simply with different values, which makes sense to be differentiated. And I just note that this, of course, should be true here and not one. But that's just a side note. But you can have multiple expects in some scenarios, in some situations. That can be fine, but typically you should try to keep your number of expect statements low, because if you're having too many expect statements, too many assertions in one and the same test, chances are high that you're actually not just testing one thing, which of course leads us back to that second point here, that you should only test one thing. So these are more rules you should keep in mind to write good tests. But these rules might bring up one other question. What exactly is one thing?